wears one that's so big that if like, I mean, I could like stick my hand down the front of it, and the other one wears it like this. And pulls it down to talk. And I'm like, no, that's like not how this is supposed to.
Yeah.
Like, no, we'll hear you. We'll
Right.
hear you. So
Yeah.
I had to give a little bit of feedback on that, but I mean, like K-12 teachers, I mean, they're,
We good? Okay.
so like,
We good?
talk to the hours and yeah.
Hello, everybody. Let me take this off. Oh, real face. I'm Kelly Haley, and I work in the reference department here at the Fayetteville Public Library. And today we have Sasha Issenberg with us. He's the author of 3 previous books, including The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. He has covered presidential elections as a national political reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe, a columnist for Slate, and a contributor to Bloomberg Politics and Business Week. He's the Washington correspondent at Monocle, and his work has also appeared in New York, the New York Times Magazine, and George, where he was a contributing editor. He teaches right now in the political science department at UCLA. His books, thank you Pearl's books, by the way, his books will be available for signing after he speaks. And I wanted to ask you, before you leave, if you would please fill out one of those little slips in the back and drop it in the box. We would appreciate it because your feedback is kind of what helps us decide on our programming. So I will turn it over to you now. Please welcome Sasha Issenberg.
Thank you. It's good to be back in Fayetteville. Thank you. It's also thanks to Pearls for being here, because it's always exciting to hear that people are opening new independent bookstores instead of the opposite. So I wanted to, there's not a whole lot of Arkansas in my book, but there's a little bit. And this is probably the worst part of being a researcher who spent 10 years working on a project, is I'm enamored of all sorts of little findings that so far nobody else has appreciated other than me, but there's one of local interest in the state that I'll talk about. Come on in. No? Okay, don't. Maybe you guys will find it as interesting as I did. So I quote here, the book starts in the White House in 1996, and April of 1996, Bill Clinton is asked basically what his position on same-sex marriage is. A few weeks later, the Defense of Marriage Act is going to come out of Congress. It's the first time there's been any sort of federal legislation on related to same-sex marriage. Clinton had been asked once in, as best I can tell, in 1992 as a candidate, what his opinion on marriage was. He had never spoken a word about this, but Reader's Digest had given a questionnaire to candidates, to both Bush and Clinton, that had like 10 questions on it that were sort of all over the place. And they asked, one of these questions was, would you support a law to legalize same-sex marriages? And Clinton gave what I think was a 1 or 2 sentence answer that says, no, I would not support such a law, which sort of came up in 1996 because the White House puts out talking points initially, and then this becomes sort of part of their language about his support for the Defense of Marriage Act, where they say Bill Clinton, as he did when he ran for president, Clinton opposes same-sex marriage. When you actually look at the way that question was phrased, it was asking him to address a hypothetical policy question that has never, even 30 years later, come up in American life, which is a federal law to support same-sex marriage. It sort of evaded the point of the question, but the broader issue, which was, this had not been a political issue when he ran for president in 1992, and now in 1996, it was going to come to his desk, as it did in the fall of 1996, in the form of the Defense of Marriage Act, which told both states that they do not have to recognize same-sex marriages from other states, and more importantly, defined under federal law that marriage could only apply to opposite-sex couples. And so the story, so one, the bigger evasion was the idea that Bill Clinton had this deeply held view on same-sex marriage that had been like aired and articulated during the campaign. By 1992, there was barely a politician in the United States who'd been asked his or her opinion on same-sex marriage. The idea that this was something that was like deeply felt in his core convictions just belies how new this issue was. And so that's part of the reason I wanted to start in 1996, where you see this on the desk of a president and you see how surprising it was that just 5 years earlier this was not an issue that one could imagine any political elected official in the United States or court dealing with. And so I spent a little bit of time trying to dig into the sort of LGBT advocacy world over the course of the 1992 campaign, because I wanted to, they kept on referring to, Clinton had said this during 92, I could eventually found the Reader's Digest thing, but what was remarkable is none of the gay rights groups asked him about it. So I found the questionnaires from the Human Rights Campaign, from the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, which were the two large ones. They had not asked about gay marriage. They were asking about, should hate crimes laws cover gays and lesbians? Should gays and lesbians be allowed to serve in the military and in other sensitive federal posts? Should things about AIDS funding? Nothing about marriage. And so I kept on trying to dig into to find, was there something I was missing that Clinton had been part of this conversation on? I interviewed a whole bunch of people who were involved in the Clinton White House and the campaign. And over the course of that research, I found remarkably something that didn't directly apply to Clinton, but I think is of interest here. So in 1973, as you guys know, Bill Clinton is preparing to run against John Paul Hammerschmidt in this district. In Pulaski County in Little Rock, the prosecuting attorney of the state's 6th Judicial District gets a letter from the Pulaski County clerk and asks whether same-sex marriages should be whether same-sex couples should be entitled to marriage. So we're in 1973, we're 3 or 4 years after Stonewall. And what sort of happens in the wake of Stonewall is you get this sort of outpouring of activist energy in what people are calling the gay liberation movement. And it takes a lot of forms. And so you have gays, lesbians, bisexuals sort of testing the limits of what full citizenship might represent. And in some places, that includes gay and lesbian couples going out and requesting marriage licenses from local officials. And in a few places around the country, they sue. In most cases, they do not have a real lawyer behind these. There's no obvious legal strategy. But you get cases in both state and federal court that challenge the exclusion of gay and lesbian couples from marriage. There's not a civil rights organization, LGBT or otherwise, that is supporting these suits. There's no legal strategy. I said, they don't really, and they die out at sort of the first chance where they could get stopped. And I'm not entirely sure what precipitated this question in 1973, but so here you have the county clerk asking the prosecuting attorney, hey, what's the law on this? Because a lot of states at this point have not actually, it turns out that if you look in their state code, they don't always specify when they say that the qualifications for marriage, that it has to be a man and a woman, or it can only be one man and one woman. And so sometimes there's enough ambiguity in the statute that people think that might be an opening. So Lee Munson was the prosecuting attorney for the 6th Judicial District, and he, I assume it's a he, writes, maybe that's an unfair inference. Please be advised that the law on this question is still evolving, and there is no settled rule. We feel that the Arkansas Supreme Court would hold against the proposition, but the United States Supreme Court may hold for it. So we're in 1973, almost 40 years before this in any form comes before the U.S. Supreme Court, and there's enough uncertainty about the sort of legal and political world in which this would land in the 1970s that a legal official in Arkansas thinks it's possible that the U.S. Supreme Court would vote, and would vote to say that there's a constitutional right, presumably, to same-sex marriage. No court on earth makes that determination until the Hawaii Supreme Court in 1993, which becomes the first court to rule that the fundamental right to marriage, guaranteed under the Hawaii state constitution, could extend to same-sex couples. God bless you. And so, to some extent, the book I wrote starts in Hawaii in 1990 with the really unlikely origins of that Hawaii suit. But the sort of early politics or legal expectations of that are just, the groundwork of the 1970s and 80s has just become so clear how foreign this was as a concept, and how little instinct there was about how to sort of process it in the template that we have of American law and politics. And it's this really unlikely story of how an issue comes out of nowhere. And in those sort of 6 years between the beginning of this Hawaii case in 1990 and is showing up in the Clinton White House in 1996, the whole sort of infrastructure of American law and politics has to organize to deal with this. So not just politicians up to the president and courts, but interest groups, advocacy organizations, the political parties, all of a sudden have to sort of decide where they are on this issue. And it goes obviously from being a non-issue and within 10 years, I think, you'd say probably becomes the dominant area of social and cultural conflict in the United States. And it's in that period that I was sort of drawn to this topic. I started work on this in 2011. At that point, only I think 7 states had legalized same-sex marriage at that point. But we were already starting to talk about this as the kind of defining civil rights movement, social movement of my lifetime. And I was shocked by how little I knew about where this issue would come from. On the night that the New York State Senate voted in June 2011 to legalize marriage, New York became the first large state to do this through the political process as opposed to having it initiated through the courts. And I remember the CNN coverage switching over from the Capitol in Albany to a scene outside of the Stonewall Tavern in Greenwich Village. And actually was not a particularly large or interesting scene of people, shocking the people on this area. In the village were not closely following the New York State Senate for guidance on where to party. But it was this effort to put this in a familiar arc of American history, and even to put it in an arc of sort of iconic LGBT history in the United States. And I was just struck that I'd lived through the whole life of this issue. I'd covered politics through most of it. And we were already starting to talk about this as again, like, the sort of defining civil rights movement. And we just didn't have a public vocabulary. I did not know who the Rosa Parks or the Little Rocks, what the central high of this movement was, or the Haymarket riots of this movement, and how, and so I sort of set out to, tell the entire story of it. And a lot of the models for that were big books that had been written about the civil rights movement, the movement for racial equality in the U.S., and that I had read in high school and college, many of which were written by journalists, starting in the mid to late 70s, that were the first serious efforts to make sense of a big, messy, generational conflict that took place in the streets and in the courts and in legislatures and everything. And one of the things that was most surprising to me as I started that was I guess I had read too many books about the civil rights movement, and sort of had inculcated the idea that when you read the really good histories of especially the desegregation cases, Simple Justice by Dick Kluger about the sort of long road to Brown v. Board is excellent at this, is you see how basically the Brown v. Board cases were the culmination of 30 years of sort of relentless strategizing by, ultimately the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Thurgood Marshall becomes the sort of captain of those cases, but that there's a whole sort of infrastructure of African American lawyering that is set up to build what they lay out in a determined strategy as a sort of edifice of precedents that can get them to ultimately take down segregation of public schools. I mean, and you see that this is a very long and patient journey to try to undo Plessy v. Ferguson. You know, Howard University Law School is founded explicitly to train black lawyers to file these types of cases. And I just operated under the assumption, having read, histories of the women's movement that sort of trace back to whether Seneca Falls, but that people had a long vision that they realized decades later. I assumed that there had to have been some sort of central organizing person or institution or movement that laid out the strategy that got us from wherever there was to wherever here was going to be. And what was remarkable is how it wasn't. And the place to start my book is this really petty fight for control of a Pride planning committee in Honolulu that spirals out of control when a local activist basically launches a PR stunt out of a sense of grievance with other folks in the LGBT community in the local ACLU chapter. And he is not a lawyer. He has no legal strategy. He's not clearly thinking, more than a step and a half ahead of him, and ends up triggering this momentous lawsuit that forces the rest of the country to respond. And it is a story that's sort of inconvenient to it's a story that never really got told before, I think in part because, I think there are a few reasons for it, but in part because the sort of LGBT rights establishment found this an inconvenient story. That the story they want to tell is one of sort of deliberate, something a lot closer to what we think of as the story that leads to Brown v. Board, which is really deliberate legal political strategy, deciding not just which cases to file, but which cases not to file and in what sequence. And this ends up catalyzing a dramatic change that 25 years later expands, to a whole class of people who'd been denied a fundamental right, inclusion into the central institution in American life, without a plan. And that was something that nobody really had an institutional interest in promoting, because it told a very different story about how activism can happen by accident, out of, sometimes like not particularly noble motivations, people starting processes they can't control, things spiraling beyond their initial vision. And what in this moment, there's something kind of inspiring about that, not in that we should all, engage in PR stunts because maybe they'll deliver a radical change down the line, but it shows how little we are locked into the sort of political menu and agenda that's before us. Same-sex marriage is not a meaningful political issue, and 5 years later, the President of the United States is dealing with it. And I think for those of us now who look at what's happening in Washington, look and you sort of think that our politics are narrow and limited by partisan divides and institutional barriers, and that this sort of, and that we have a limited political imagination as a country now, it is, I found, inspiring to think of the ability of local events as far away as you can get from Washington in the United States to force something onto the desk of a president through some combination of farsightedness and luck and so, I really thought of this as sort of about the invention of an issue, the discovery of an issue, and that's why I was coming across that 1973 Arkansas legal letter is great, because one of the most fun parts for me about writing, especially the early parts of this book that are set up and through the 1990s, is watching and hopefully sharing with the reader the experience of watching people grapple with a new issue for the first time, something they've never been forced to think about. And so that, I guess on that note, let's take some questions. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Say it again, because I guess, yeah.
Didn't Obama sort of hedge on gay marriage, same-sex marriage, and then say, I think he's kind of waiting for public opinion to kind of get up to that
Yeah.
level.
So Obama's story on this is, I think, illustrative of both. I think he had a very good nose over the course of his political career on this issue in particular, where the center of his key constituency was at any given moment. So, he runs for the first time for office in 1996 for state senate from a liberal district around the University of Chicago, a biracial liberal district around the University of Chicago. He gets asked in one of these questionnaires, it's another weirdly worded question. It would be, it's some version of the, would you support or oppose a bill to ban gay marriage in the state legislature or something? But he comes out he says, I support same-sex marriage in 1996 on this questionnaire. He ultimately wins that race. He gets again asked on another questionnaire, I think this time by a gay newspaper in Chicago, he supports same-sex marriage. He then runs in 2000 for Congress. He's running now in a largely African-American district against an incumbent who has very strong ties to the local black church community. And, a big driver of Obama's strategy is that he needs to no longer be just a sort of popular with white liberals and upper middle class blacks around the university, but now he needs to kind of break into the world of the black church. And this is the period where Obama becomes more deeply involved in Jeremiah Wright's congregation, and all of a sudden now he opposes same-sex marriage. But the one thing that's happened between 1996 and 2000 is now it's not just a two-sided issue. It's not just you think gay and lesbian couples should be able to marry or not. There'd been a lawsuit in Vermont that the Vermont Supreme Court rules in 1999 and says that under the Vermont Constitution, it is discriminatory to deny the equal benefits of marriage to gay and lesbian couples. But the Vermont Supreme Court tells the legislature, you don't actually have to let gay and lesbian couples marry as a result of this. You just need to find some way to give them the equal benefits. And the legislature comes back with the term the institution of civil unions, a term that had not really been used before. And the idea is all of the legal rights and benefits, the same process for getting in and out as marriage, but you do it under a different name that in theory does not provoke the same sort of religious traditionalist, doesn't have the same emotional valence around it. And very quickly, civil unions becomes the safe position for, basically national Democrats of all kinds. And so over the course of the 2000s, Hillary Clinton supports civil unions, Joe Biden supports civil unions, and Barack Obama supports civil unions. And each one of them says some version of the same thing about this, which is, I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, but I think the gay and lesbian couple should be entitled to all the same legal rights and benefits under the law. And that's Obama's position in 2000. That's his position when he gets elected to the Senate in 2004. And when he runs for president in 2008, that's his position. And when the one shift you see with Obama is over the course of those years, there are times where he talks about it in more and more religious terms. There's a sort of remarkable event from just the perspective of how our presidential candidates and campaigns have changed. In the summer of 2008, Obama and John McCain are both invited to Saddleback Church to sit on stage with Rick Warren, where he asks them something like a 45 minutes interview about some, with personal and political questions. And Obama lays it on pretty thick with the religious tie. He says, I believe marriage between a man and a woman, but God is also in the mix. And there were people in Obama's circle who thought that this was pretty disingenuous. I think I quote David Axelrod, I believe, called it, he thought Obama was BSing on this. There are people who thought that this was not Obama's deeply held position, and they were not questioning this actually as a matter of political strategy. They thought it was the right place for him to be, but they didn't think he actually necessarily believed what he was saying on this. And so he gets elected as a civil union supporter, an opponent of legalizing same-sex marriage, but also opponent of the Defense of Marriage Act. And what happens in his first term is that the White House counsel's office and the Justice Department basically decide that they are, by the summer of 2009, Obama tells his lawyers, I no longer want to, the Defense of Marriage Act is being challenged in court for its constitutionality, and Obama tells the White House lawyers, I'm ready to stop defending this law, which is a really unusual thing for a president to say, but you guys need to figure out how I get there in a sort of legally sound way. And in the early 2011, Eric Holder, who's the Attorney General, announces that the Justice Department will no longer defend the Defense of Marriage Act in court, and the Obama White House had approached this very gingerly. They were concerned about a lot of blowback from this decision. I think both from conservatives who would be critical of the underlying, that who would say that he was too liberal on pro-gay marriage, whatever, but then more to the point that there'd be a broader sort of process critique of that, how, the unusual situation of a president making basic, what they would say would be a political calculation not to defend a law. And they were shocked when he does this, and there was hardly any media coverage. Republicans on the Hill were not talking about it. It just kind of like happened with a lot less controversy than they had expected. And so that emboldens the White House to realize how much less controversial this issue might be. And the big turning point, as I describe in my book, is in June of 2011 when the New York legalizes marriage. Governor Andrew Cuomo signs a marriage equality bill into law, and Obama just a couple weeks later is in New York to do a pair of fundraisers for the Democratic National Committee, one of which is an LGBT themed fundraiser. He gets heckled at his own fundraiser, so he's being heckled by people who spent like $2,300 to be in a room with him for being opposed to marriage. And Obama is this really chafes at him for a few reasons. One, at the same time, Andrew Cuomo, of all people, who was never seen as a great progressive or particularly bold politician in any form, is being celebrated by these same lefty activists for his courage in having shepherded this bill into law, and Obama is being seen by folks who he thinks of as his people, lauding Andrew Cuomo and attacking him. And he goes to his advisors and he says, like, now I'm willing, we changed the legal position of the White House with regard to defense. He's like, now I'm willing to change my personal political position on this, but you guys need to figure out how exactly I do that. And there was this real understanding that I think, partially because of the issue, because he talked about it in these deeply personal ways, and then partially because he's president of the United States and he's not the, county clerk of Pulaski, that you can't just sort of fly under the radar changing your position on something like this. And then he needs to have a kind of, he needs to explain it. And so they spend the better part of a year from the summer of 2011 up until the spring of 2012 figuring out, sort of weighing different ways for him to do this before election. They think it ultimately will be a net positive that'll help with fundraising, it'll help with volunteer and activist support. But they also don't want to, they think there might be some backlash politically, and that generally the advantage would be not to make it a big issue in the campaign. And that means finding a time that is early enough that whenever he announces this, it will not, there's enough space between it and the convention and then and the debates that it will not overshadow events. They basically want to run against Mitt Romney as a rich guy who's going to shut down your local factory, not run on, did Obama flip-flop on gay marriage. And so the ultimate plan is that there are people in the White House who suggest he give a big speech, like the way he gave a speech on race in Philadelphia during the campaign in 2008. There's a fear that that'll draw too much attention to this. And ultimately, the consensus is that the best way to interview, there had been some research that showed that a female interviewer is better than a male interviewer for this. I don't know what research shows 4 female interviewers are better than 1, but there was a plan to have him do this on The View. So there was an expectation he'd be in New York in June of 2012 for another fundraiser. He would go on The View. They would sort of tee up through producers. You should ask him about gay marriage. He's going to make news. And he would come out and talk about his evolution on this. And that was the plan within the White House. Joe Biden was aware of according to my reporting, the general contours of this plan, but not the specifics necessarily of the schedule. And what you may remember is the first Sunday in May of 2012, Joe Biden goes on Meet the Press and is asked, do you still oppose same-sex marriage? And he gives an answer that I dare you right now to go watch the video or look at the transcript and diagram that sentence and be 100% confident you know what he is trying to say. And granted, this is the period where, Joe Biden talked too much as opposed to talk too little. So, and there was real ambiguity among Biden's advisors about whether he had said anything new or different. The White House tried to respond immediately by saying, no, what he said wasn't any different. This is the view of the administration. It became pretty clear they recorded that Friday afternoon, became pretty clear Monday morning that in the White House press briefing, the press secretary was asked something like 43 times by reporters something about this, and it was pretty clear that the media was not accepting that there was no news made, and that fundamentally this represented a difference between Biden and Obama. And the calculation from Obama's folks was, we can't wait another month to clarify this on our terms, because the way it's getting covered is either Biden is undercutting the president and the president isn't putting him in his place, or Biden is more liberal than the president on this sensitive issue, and that's not great, or they disagree on a thing. And so 2 days later, Obama decides, let's do this. They invite Robin Roberts from ABC, and Obama gives that interview on a Wednesday afternoon and basically does what he would have done about a month later on a more controlled timeline. And so, I think some of the lore has been that Biden forced his hand or pushed him to do this, and Biden definitely changed the circumstances under which he did something that he was already planning to do. But that's the sort of the story of how Obama got to gay marriage. And then one of the remarkable things in retrospect is Obama's language in that interview is he says, I personally support same-sex marriage, but I think states should be free to do whatever they want. This has historically been a state issue, and I think states should be free to work this out through their own political and legal process. Barely 2 years later, he is sending his Solicitor General before the United States Supreme Court to say that states that had banned same-sex marriage, or states that had not legalized same-sex marriage through amending their constitutions, through court rulings, whatever, were acting in violation of constitutional guarantees. And there was a lot of scrutiny of Obama's sort of change of position on the political question of marriage, there's been surprisingly little discussion for former constitutional law lecturer on how dramatically his sort of take on the federalism and constitutional questions at play here changed just over a couple of years when he did this momentous thing that, in terms of sending his Solicitor General to argue that state laws were unconstitutional.
Well, I think just kind of picking up a little bit on this, I'm sure it varies from person to person, and it can be very hard to tie down. But I mean, how much do you think? I mean, Hillary Clinton got into a kind of a tiff with Terry Gross about Terry Gross saying, "Well, you probably always believed in gay marriage. You just changed. It was political expediency." And I think somewhat with. Obama probably could have had a constitutional path in his head of why gay marriage should be legal before he came out for it. So, do you have any sense to the effect that political leaders were legitimately changing their minds, or they had a more liberal, if that's the right word, stance, and were just kind of following the population?
Yeah. So, I'm in a way sympathetic to folks because they're being asked in a very presentist way a different question than they were being asked at the time. And so some of the opposition to same-sex marriage throughout the 2000s, especially among that sort of group of Democrats who were in the pro-civil unions, was that they were, So first of all, in the 90s, this was basically an imaginary question. There wasn't a state, no place in the United States were same-sex couples able to legally marry until 2004. I think a lot of Democrats honestly believed that the elevation of this local issue in Hawaii to a federal question through the Defense of Marriage Act was basically a trap being set by Republicans. And I think there's some truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that, one of the things that sort of comes through in my book is how, same-sex marriage was not an issue in the United States until the anti-gay right decided that it was going to organize itself largely around opposing marriage, and that forced a sense of unanimity on the gay rights side. And what that meant for politicians was that they saw this maybe the way that right now Democrats talk about, like when they're asked questions on critical race theory, for example, which is like, this isn't a real issue. My opponents basically are taking this small local thing and elevating it into some big boogeyman to scaremonger, and I'm not going to engage with it because I give credence to the idea that this is something that we need to be talking about, and I'd rather be talking about X and Y. And it was not unreasonable, I think, for most of the 90s. At most, this was a local issue in the Hawaii courts and then in the Hawaii legislature. And yet, I think, so a lot of Democrats, I think, resisted having to talk about it and sort of shut down the debate that way, I think, is one part of it. The other part of it is once civil unions emerge as an option, I think a lot of Democrats reasonably buy into a sort of gradualist, incrementalist view that the path to acceptance of gay and lesbian couples will come through civil unions, and that the best way to get there is to juxtapose them to make them the more moderate conservative option compared to marriage and play up the third side of the issue. And to do that, you need to say, I'm opposed to this other, triangulation, not in an institutional sense, but on an issue. It was sort of made for this. And so I think a lot of Democrats thought that they were doing a good thing for recognition of gay and lesbian families by advancing the civil unions cause as best possible. And it proves effective. One thing that becomes clear by the time Obama decides he's going to change his position in 2011, it is much safer for him to, certainly within the Democratic Party, to support gay marriage. But it's not yet a 50% issue in the country. Roughly the polling by 2010 on gay marriage is like 40, low 40s support for marriage equality. There's roughly a third of the country that I think you would just say at this point is fundamentally anti-gay and opposed to a whole range of equal rights for LGBT folks. And then the third or so in the middle are people who support civil unions but oppose same-sex marriage, who basically have become persuaded by a decade of hearing prominent Democrats say, offer that formulation that I think marriage is between a man and a woman, but you could still give them all the equal rights. And the campaigns that have to be waged in states in 2012 are not to win over people who are fundamentally anti-gay to support recognizing gay couples, but to give it to people who think that you can give gay and lesbian couples everything they need and deserve with civil unions and not have to engage with what marriage means. And so I think some politicians thought that did not recognize that they sort of created their own trap in opposing it because, and then I think that, some of it was just such risk aversity on the part of Democratic politicians. Polling in 1996 was 27% support for marriage. It was in the 30s in 2004. The story that became told, I think inaccurately, around the 2004 election was that this cost John Kerry the presidency. And so I think a lot of Democrats just shut down even engaging honestly with where they stood on the issue because it was so evident to them that, maybe in all but a few dozen of the most liberal congressional districts in the country that that the downsides of supporting same-sex marriage outweigh. You get to when the Defense of Marriage Act debate starts in 1996, I could find two senators who supported marriage equality. One was Ted Kennedy, and the other was Ron Wyden, who had said he was supporting gay marriage basically by accident because he didn't really understand what he was being asked. A decade later, two governors for the first time, Deval Patrick and Eliot Spitzer in 2006, get elected for the first time running as pro-gay marriage candidates statewide. That's really unusual. So it's like, those folks were laggards, but they weren't on the cutting edge, but they weren't actually laggards. And the center of gravity in the Democratic Party was there, and I think that it was, where I think that folks have been the most, as I recall that exchange with Terry Gross, there was something that was clearly disingenuous, which was talking about the Defense of Marriage Act, where they said that Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act to forestall a constitutional amendment, and it just would have been worse. There was no talk about a constitutional amendment until 2000. That's just purely ahistorical. What there was in the White House was a fear that this was basically the Republicans had put forward a bill to sort of force Clinton to choose between his liberal base and what was obviously the most popular issue with persuadable voters. And that the fear that in the Clinton White House, one of the calculations was if he says he supports this bill, then the incentive will be for congressional Republicans to just make it worse from a gay rights perspective. And then maybe they'll put a ban on adoption in there, and that they'll just load it up with poison pills so that eventually he has to take, that in their efforts to twist him, because ultimately they gave him a chance to moderate. And it's not clear that strategically it served that purpose. And so there were different calculations in the White House about the downside of endorsing that. But I mean, I think, the important thing for thinking about how sincere people were on this position is that the other thing that Bill Clinton said at the time, which was true, is that nobody was harmed by the Defense of Marriage Act for another 8 years. And because this was so imaginary, there weren't couples marrying any state in the country. It wasn't until people could legally marry in Massachusetts, and then you started to have couples who, for the first time, legally married. There was about the legal ambiguity of this. They got their marriage licenses. Massachusetts told them they were married, and then couples went to get Social Security survivor benefits, and we're told by the federal government, no, under the Defense of Marriage Act, you're not married. Couple goes to change their passport, they file a name change on a passport because it's a lesbian couple who have a kid. They were going to travel overseas and they want to have the same last name on both of the parents' passports. So both parents have the same last name as the kid. And the State Department comes back and says, no, under the Defense of Marriage Act, we don't recognize you as married. Somebody dies, wants to be buried in the same veteran cemetery as a spouse, can't. And it takes 8 years for you to have real human harm for the Defense of Marriage Act. And so part of that conversation was her sort of justifying the Defense of Marriage Act. And I think in a sense that was a real thing, which is that I think it was very viable to think in 1996 that this was mean-spirited, as Bill Clinton said, but actually did no real harm to human lives because they could not actually imagine that anytime soon gay and lesbian couples would be allowed to marry anywhere. And it was a sort of imaginary harm. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else in this large audience have any questions?
There were people in the there are gay activists who don't think marriage is the right, path.
Yeah.
What do you think was won and lost by focusing on putting so much energy in toward marriage equality?
Yeah. So there was a sort of active debate. There were sort of before Hawaii, there's an active but very abstract debate over the merit of fighting for marriage. We called it marriage equality then, but marriage rights. And you had a tension between. You had some folks who were sort of had a strategic quarrel with this, which is kind of an incrementalist, gradualist critique of marriage. At this point, civil unions weren't on the table, but there were domestic partnership registries and statutes in some places. There were companies that were beginning to extend benefits in the late 80s, some universities to same-sex partners of their employees. And the argument was, we're actually making progress on these things, on non-discrimination laws. Why would we start fighting for this big other thing that's a distraction or whatever? Okay, so that I think was at the time a pretty sensible critique. And then you had a sort of ideological divide, and it played on in sort of two axes. One between those arguing for marriage, for prioritizing marriage, who were disproportionately male, were saying some version of we will never win equality until we have inclusion in all the major institutions of American life. I think that the civil rights movement for racial equality, which from a de jure perspective, basically peaks with Loving v. Virginia. That was a meaningful model for them. It said, we're never going to get full equality until we get inclusion in everything, especially marriage. And then on the other side, you had sort of two factions that were arguing, pushing against this. One were people who'd been shaped by the sort of more liberationist tendencies of the post-Stonewall era, who, basically were arguing part of the success of the gay rights movement or the gay community has been the shaping of a community that is defined apart from, if not in conflict or contrast with, traditional heterosexual mores about relationship, family, sex, love. And I'm paraphrasing somebody I quote in there, but why would we as a movement aspire to win acceptance into the white picket fence, whatever, of our 1950s lily white parents? And so that's one sort of active critique. Why, the sort of, anti-heteronormative gender lines is, LGBT family law in the 1980s is almost entirely the province of women. So, the problem from a legal perspective was women who had been in heterosexual marriages, had had a child, come out of the closet, get divorced, and then have to go to court to fight for the rights to their own biological children. And they were the basically only clients for LGBT family law services, and overwhelmingly women. And these lawyers had gone to college and law school in the 60s and 70s, had been shaped by sort of second wave feminist thinking about marriage. And their opposition to fighting for marriage rights, I think, came from a place less as lesbians and more as feminists. And it was, why would we, as women, fight for inclusion in an institution that we think has existed and been perpetuated solely to subjugate women? And so this was a very active but abstract debate among lawyers and legal theorists and LGBT academics in the 1980s. But because there wasn't an active court case, nobody really had to wrestle with this. And it ends up being, as I suggested earlier, like the unanimous opposition of the opposition of their opponents that sort of creates unanimity among them. But even so you don't have anybody from the late, there's no, there are activists who throughout to this day are kind of anti-marriage, but everybody who's in any position within the sort of LGBT political legal advocacy world by the late 90s sees that they need to fight for marriage rights. The question is how aggressively and how much of a priority it is. And there are very few people who want to make it a priority, part because they see it as a loser of an issue, right? Every time this thing comes to the ballot, in the first 34 states that put this to the ballot, it loses. They're winning in a few select state courts, but by and large, public opinion is negative. There are politicians who want nothing to do with this issue, including people who are like Bill Clinton, who you thought were your allies, too. Gay rights groups, human rights campaign, the task force, for a variety of reasons, don't want to take this on. And what really changes there is that the money, there's a sort of cluster of donors led by a guy named Tim Gill, who is a software developer mogul in Colorado. And he has a circle of, almost all male, white male rich guys who decide that of all the things on the sort of menu of LGBT priorities, the thing they care the most about is marriage. And I think the short answer for that is rich guys care a lot about estate planning, and you can buy your way out of a lot of other problems. You can buy your way out of housing discrimination. You can, private security your way out of worrying that you're going to get gay bashed, but the estate tax exemption comes for all of us. And so they were really uniquely focused on marriage, and it became clear to other parts of the movement that by in 2005, Gill funds a meeting and takes place in Jersey City, New Jersey, of the major figures from all the major gay rights organizations, and they come up with a strategy for winning marriage nationwide. This is 2005. They recognize it's an optimistic strategy at the time, but they lay out how they could win before the Supreme Court in 2025. And that starts to send a signal to groups that the money is going to be there, and for state and federal groups that if you're doing marriage work, there are a lot of rich guys who are going to start giving you money, and if you're not doing marriage work, then some other group's going to get that. And so that's sort of what redirects movement resources behind this. Now, like the counterfact, we look back, and I think you would say that over the 30 years we've been talking about this here, that, the most successful parts of the gay rights movement have been marriage and military inclusion, at least at the federal level, which is ironic given that they're arguably the two most conservative institutions in American life. Whether that's ironic or that explains why there were gains there, I guess, is the question. And then the thing is, you look back at what hasn't happened. On the same day in 1996 that the Senate passes the Defense of Marriage Act, 85 votes to 14, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which would have basically banned the use of sexual orientation in decisions about hiring and firing, comes one vote short in the Senate. And the 50th, it's 50 votes to 49. Al Gore is sitting there waiting to break a tie. The 50th vote, who had promised that he would vote for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, was David Pryor, who was stuck in Little Rock at the hospital bed side of his son Mark. And I have a scene in the book where one of Kennedy's aides is crying, begging, can we hold the vote open? Can we get a military plane to Little Rock to just fly him here for the vote and back? And Kennedy says to the aide, like, don't worry, we're going to, we came really close. We're going to have another shot soon. We're now 25 years later. Not only has the Defense of Marriage Act been struck down by the Supreme Court, but marriage is the law of the land, and the successor bill to ENDA, the Equality Act, is basically not much farther towards becoming law, still waiting for a vote in a new Senate. And so I think the question is, would these other priorities, if marriage hadn't been there, would these other priorities have filled the void and gotten the resources and fundamentally changed the dynamic? One of the arguments that's made, I think most articulately by Evan Wolfson, who is a sort of leading cheerleader and strategist on the marriage thing, is that marriage, I think his line is like, marriage is the issue that lifts all boats, or something, that because public opinion, that it's sort of a gateway to recognition, understanding, acceptance of how gays and lesbians live, because it's so understandable. It's not complex like employment non-discrimination law. Like, literally, I was able to explain the broad contours of this book to my 5-year-old nephew. He does not know a lot about employment law. That it became accessible. It had a cultural salience that a lot of these other more technical civil rights issues don't, and that it helps pave the way for state and federal gains in other areas. The flip side is that this issue, dominated attention and money in a way. And so, what I think is, I'm not convinced that if there hadn't been a push around marriage, that you would have federal civil rights protections for the entirety of the LGBT community. What I think is reasonable is, what did happen to some degree, and I'm not sure, is that a lot of the infrastructure that had been developed to fight marriage turned immediately towards sort of gender identity and transgender issues. And it's so clear that is now, that in this broad coalition, that's where the conflict is now. And, I was pretty selective about the words I use. Like, I was talking a lot about gays and lesbians because, just to state the obvious, there were a lot of bisexual and transgender people who were always allowed to marry the person they loved, regardless of what the laws were around same-sex marriage. And so this was very much an issue that is relevant to gays and lesbians, not necessarily an issue that is relevant to bisexual and transgender people. And to some extent, if we think about like the coalition, the people who got left behind to some degree, the people who are certainly not benefiting from these legal changes.
And so, like, that brings up kind of my last question. I mean, you talked about, or the conservative political movement, sort of created an issue that wasn't there. Trying to trap Democrats or liberals on an issue of marriage equality. And you've already sort of mentioned critical race theory, which is beyond gender or in sexual identity, but also there seems to be increased, anti-trans legislation. Do you think there are lessons or paths for folks to navigate that come out from the issues related to gay marriage?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is to recognize how, there are, I think, two sort of factors that helped along the cause of marriage equality that existed entirely apart from the political and legal work that helped this cause, right? One is biology. Actually, let me step back for a second. One is we know that the thing that is people coming out and people knowing that the people who around them are gay or lesbian. I'm going to state the obvious. I spent a lot of time in writing this, thinking about the differences between this and the racial equality movement, other social movements in the United States. And to state the obvious, one thing that's really important to note is that gays and lesbians and bisexual and transgender people, but are born to straight people. There are not a lot of African American kids being born to white couples. There are not a lot of immigrant kids being born to native-born couples. There are not a lot of Muslim kids being born to Catholic couples. And so, we and everything we think we understand about the very complex interaction between heredity and environment suggests they are probably evenly distributed across the population. And so, we know that the thing that is the biggest driver of liberal attitudes on gay rights issues, not just marriage, is how somebody answers the polling question, do you know somebody who's openly gay or lesbian? The first time the earliest I've seen that question asked, which I think was 1982 or 1983, was something like, do you have a friend, a colleague, a friend, coworker, or family member who's openly gay or lesbian? I think it was 20-something% of people said yes. Now I think it's near 100, and I'm going to presume that the number of gay people in the United States is probably pretty close to what it was then, but obviously a lot more people are coming out, and just because of the nature, biology serves this fundamentally desegregating force that you don't have ethnic enclaves, you don't have neighborhood. People realize that their neighbors, their relatives, their friends, their coworkers are gay or lesbian. By all accounts, that same thing is happening with gender identity, and so I presume that and then the other part of the sort of biological equation, the other thing that's happening in the background of the political and legal changes around marriage, is that our understanding of that biological basis for sexual orientation changed a lot over a generation. And so, I went back and read a lot of news coverage in the 1990s. Every story in Time or Newsweek about a gay rights issue in the 1990s had a paragraph like, to be sure, we don't know whether sexual orientation is a matter of nature or nurture. Scientists are divided. Nobody talks that way anymore. Polling shows that people across their political orientation think that sexual orientation is not. And even conservative politicians who are still, who are anti-gay in their policy positions don't talk about a choice or a lifestyle. And it is far downstream from, laboratory findings about the actual genetic basis for sexual orientation, which I'm not a scientist. My understanding is, we suspect there's something there, but we don't know how strong or weak it is, and we don't know how it interacts with other things. But we just talk about a whole lot of things in our society very differently now than we did 30 years ago, not just around sexual behavior or identity, but about temper and addiction and so those things, I think, change the foundation on which the political and legal conflicts around marriage do. And I think we are at the end of a cycle of accepting, of being, coming to terms, Americans especially coming to terms with their gay and lesbian people everywhere, and they didn't choose to be that way, and then deciding what a just and fair and equitable society does with that fact. And we're at the early part of that cycle on kind of awareness of transgender issues. And I suspect that, a lot more people are going to identify as gender nonconforming, I guess, in some way or another, in the next decade or two, and realize that their communities include transgender people. And I think that, whatever sort of flow of knowledge from laboratories comes into popular understanding will give us a more common vocabulary for how to talk and think about the intersection between sex and gender, basically. And I think the reassuring part for folks who are doing work on transgender acceptance is that it seems to me inevitable that these trends are going to move in a favorable direction for them. The potentially unsettling thing for folks who are doing this in real time, and is that my book covers 25 years, which compared to other social movements in American history feels like a blip in the lives of people who wanted to marry. 25 years is quite a long time. And so I think that understanding, thinking about the long-term changes is important, because some of the short-term calculations will change as a result of that. The thing that is different, one thing that was notable when I thought about why this was faster than the women's rights movement, the efforts at sort of desegregation, which I guess you could say like roughly 75 years from Seneca Falls to women getting the vote nationwide, roughly 75 years from the beginning of Jim Crow to desegregation, 25 years, from this being a nothing issue to being settled at the Supreme Court. Why was it so much faster and I think easier? And one thing was that there was not the majority did not have to give anything up to acquiesce to the demands of a minority here. And I think that there's a way of looking at social conflicts in American history. I think our instinct is to think about them as these contests over abstract values, over equality or justice or liberty or fair, but often they're contests over scarce resources as well. So, when women sought property rights, fathers and husbands rightfully saw that as a challenge to their wealth. When women and later African Americans fought for the vote, white men saw that as a threat to their political power. When there were efforts to desegregate public schools, whites primarily saw that as a challenge to neighborhood institutions in which their property values were tied up. Affirmative action is, the most direct way about limited places in education and employment. Every effort to expand, rights and opportunities for immigrants is seen by native-born people as a threat to their economic opportunity. Even the Americans with Disabilities Act places new economic burdens on landlords and developers to retrofit their policies. And so there are material things at stake. And one of the things that's remarkable about the marriage fight is, there wasn't anything that was really had to be given up. And the sort of potentially fun counterfactual is there's what if there were a limited number of marriage licenses in the United States or in a given state? And I suspect that the ease with which, sort of moderate straight people came around from opposing same-sex marriage to opposing same-sex marriage to supporting same-sex marriage, that would have been slowed a lot if those straight people had thought that their ability to get married or their kids' ability to get married would have been delayed or complicated because there are a bunch of people who are now getting in line in front of them, and my kid's gonna have to wait a year to get a marriage license. Well, like affirmative. I mean, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post Outlook section in June that sort of played with this idea. What if this gets back to sort of the other past. What if the defining civil rights movement or the defining demand of the LGBT rights movement over the last 30 years had been affirmative action for sexual minorities who had been explicitly excluded from, we'll say, the federal workforce? I think in 1990 that seemed as plausible a demand as equal marriage rights nationwide. not only do we want to desegregate the military, but since you guys have denied us jobs in a whole rank of the federal workforce, we want preferential treatment. I suspect it would have been a lot harder. There was Pew polling or Gallup polling earlier this summer. 70% of people support equal marriage rights. I bet that number will be a lot lower if you'd been asking them, do you support affirmative action for gays and lesbians? Because you'd have a lot of straight people who are worrying about their ability to get a job. They're worrying about their kids' ability to, and so what was remarkable about this, my book ends basically on June 26, 2015, when the Supreme Court rules in Obergefell, and it's this landmark decision right up there in the canon of major civil rights decisions, in which the court decides that a class of people had been excluded are all of a sudden afforded to marry. And what is remarkable about it compared to some of the other landmark decisions is how easy the implementation is. And, we're now almost 70 years after Brown v. Board, and we still don't really know how to desegregate neighborhood schools. We have a defined legal principle, and we don't actually know how to do it. What was the day after Obergefell, a lot of county clerks and registrars and state vital statistics bureaus have to change some lines on a form and maybe a cell on a spreadsheet. But nothing needs to change for gay and lesbian couples to marry. And that made it very easy. I think it limited the backlash, but it also made it very easy for the coalition in favor of marriage to expand. And long way around the bend to your good question is, it's pretty clear that anti-trans activists see their strongest position now not as recognition or support for trans people, but areas where they are protecting a scarce resource or admission into a scarce space that has stakeholders, single-sex schools, sports teams, the bathroom thing, which I think has a little less salience. But it does strike me that is probably politically the strongest ground, because you at least have, the big story about marriage is how quickly opposition fell away because nobody really knew why they cared about stopping gays and lesbians from marrying once we'd sort of people use the Pandora's box metaphor. Well, May 17, 2004, Massachusetts opens the Pandora's box, gay and lesbian couples are able to marry, and nobody can, even the most, strongest opponents of gay marriage can't tell a story about harm. Like, literally, they're running ads years later about one parent somewhere in the Boston exurbs who went to a school board meeting, complained that their kid was given like a Heather Has Two Mommies book, got into a fight in the parking lot, was arrested by the cops, and this is the ad that they're running, that he's the victim of gay marriage tyranny. It was just such a desperate, there was just not. And so the coalition of people who are invested on one side is growing, because it's not just gays and lesbians who can marry, but the communities around them. There are labor unions who now can negotiate for benefits with some clarity. And the circle of people on the other end are shrinking because nobody actually has a stake in fighting this anymore. The challenge for the anti-trans folks is to keep people invested in that. And I suspect that they will have better luck on things like the schools and sports leagues than they will on things like, do health insurance plans cover conversion, or transition costs, whatever, or the stakeholders. And so that's going to be the challenge for advocates, as long as the fact is we have as a society invested, especially over the last 40 years, a lot in creating single-sex institutions, and they have a lot of stakeholders in them, and that's a political problem or challenge, at least for LGBT activists now. Yeah, so 1990 is sort of where this process starts in Hawaii, which is where I don't think that arbitrarily, but chose to start my book. But you know, that Hawaii Supreme Court decision's May of '93, and it's basically takes a little over 3 years for the case to be filed, for it to come to the Hawaii Supreme Court, and that's really the moment where marriage becomes a viable legal objective and a real political issue in the United States. So in 1989, Denmark created something that in retrospect we would say is analogous to civil unions, where gay and lesbian couples had a lot of the rights and benefits, but I believe, if I recall properly, they did not have they did not have adoption rights. So it was not marriage. The first country to have, you know, fully inclusive marriage laws was the Netherlands, and I believe it took effect in 1999. You know, and now we're up to, I think it's 30. Basically, with the exception of Italy, all of our, and Japan, I guess, you know, almost all of our what we think of as our economic peer countries, you know, everywhere in Western Europe, with the exception of Italy, now has, and a few of the small countries. I don't really know why Liechtenstein and Monaco don't, but they don't. And amazingly, a lot of this, you know, very Catholic hemisphere, you know, most of South America, Mexico, have legalized marriage. But, you know, it was by the time that when you think about the international context, part of the reason the United States sometimes looks very slow because we were only like the 25th country to do it nationwide. But Massachusetts was fairly early. There were only, you know, the Netherlands, I think Belgium, and a few Canadian provinces had before then. And some of it is just that we have a distinctive system. It's not unique. Mexico and Brazil are close, but where we have a very decentralized system on divorce, on marriage laws. And so, you know, in most of the European countries, a federal law or a federal court ruling was the obvious path to doing this nationwide, as you know, whereas it was always clear that this would have to, some way or another, would have to go through the states. Thank you all.